I want to do this video to show you guys a little bit more about me in depth and kind of get familiar with my background and how I kind of got started in this business, how everything kind of came to be, and obviously how I came to be business partners with Anthony, and just kind of, you know, just more about my significance in the whole role of everything. I'm 32 years old. I was born in Miami, Florida. Then I was brought to Dallas when I was about 3 or 4 years old, and then I was raised in Dallas pretty much my whole life from there on. I spent one semester in college, and it was not for me. I tried to become a musician. So, you know, in college I went to school for guitar, which I was an avid guitar player when I was a lot younger, and I bought all the amps, I bought all the guitars, I joined all kinds of weird bands and tried to like find my foot in the music world, but ended up not going that direction, you know, but I still do play music, but it's obviously not my focus as a career, but it's definitely a passion at this point. I would say my passion for watches started very early on when I was probably 12. Right around when I was 13, my mom would take me to the malls all the time, and I would actually, first thing I would do is I'd go run to the local AD and go look at the showcases, because back then there was watches in them. There was Submariners, Daytonas, GMTs, Datejust, President. There was everything you could imagine, you know, so it was never an issue of not being able to see something. So I'd really acquired a heavy taste towards Rolex when I was like 12 or 13 years old. So this is kind of how I knew one day I would be a watch dealer, because back in my junior high days, I was 12 or 13 years old, and my mom took me to this area. It's like Chinatown, so they sold, I mean, literally they sold watches by the bags there. So you could walk in and they would have tables and tables of these, you know, fake iced out looking, well, they're not fake, but they're iced out looking Rolexes. They didn't say Rolex, they always said something like Geneve or something. And I bought like 3 or 4 of them as kind of like, they were cheap. They were like $60. And I took one to school one day. I sized it, took it to school, and somebody noticed it on my wrist. They thought, obviously, you know, being 13, somebody thought it was a Rolex, and I didn't really understand Rolex back then. So I was like, you know, yeah, whatever, you know, it's this and that. And of course, the first question is how much? And I was like, I'd sell it for like $350. And they're like, really, that's it? And I was like, yeah, I'll sell it for $350. So they bought it, and then they ended up telling their friends where they got it from, and then I had 2 or 3 more, and I ended up selling all those. And it actually got me in trouble at school. They threatened to expel me if I kept it up, because I guess they weren't about capitalism in school. So before I was a watch dealer, I was primarily working in valet. I did a lot of valet jobs throughout. And before that, I was doing car sales. I would buy and sell cars. I've worked for car dealerships. So a lot of buy and sell jobs, mostly around cars and other aspects like guitars. I tried to buy and sell anything and everything when I was like, you know, between 18 and 23. My favorite thing I ever bought and sold was something I tried to keep for myself, but I actually had to sacrifice it for the greater good of my business. It was a 1991 MR2 that I had custom built, and it was pushing like 600 wheel horsepower. So it was just a race car. So, you know, but back then, you know, I was a gearhead and I was more focused on cars. And I decided, you know, I had to take a leap and sell the car and start my watch business. So that's when things kind of took off, you know, and got more serious. And I got seriously involved with the watch community right after I sold that car, which is probably the best thing ever, because either one, that car would have killed me, or two, I would have ended up just keeping a car and working a basic job for the rest of my life. I got my first Rolex when I was, I I want to say I was like 20 or 21, and it was actually savings from valeting. I went on my lunch break during a shift, and I bought a simple Datejust. Back then it was probably $1,100, and I think I flipped it for like $1,700. I made my first $600, and I thought it was absolutely amazing, because you got to keep in mind, when you're a valet, it would take, you know, 5 to 7 days to make that kind of money, and I made it in 1 hour. It was at a pawn shop, just a local pawn shop down the street from where I was valeting. I went on my lunch break. I was like, that's when I started thinking about it. Like I started thinking, where can I find watches? And pawn shops was, the biggest place to find watches back then. This is well before, Chrono 24 was, big, and eBay was big with watches. You had to really hunt for watches. You had to really dive deep if you wanted to find watches for sale, especially from private party. I sold my first watch to a retail, actually. I didn't have a wholesale outlet back then. So I actually listed the watch on Craigslist. I bought a little light box, shot it really nice, cleaned it up, and threw it up on Craigslist for like $2,000, and the guy negotiated me down to $1,700. And the first watch I bought was a Rolex Datejust two-tone rose gold Buckley dial, which was a non-quick, which was, to this day, I've never seen another one. If I ever see one, I don't care what price it is, I'll buy it. So when I first started flipping watches back in 2012, when I did my first deal, it wasn't until 2014 I took the leap and I quit my job full-time at the valet. And I'll tell you why I quit. It was kind of a crazy story. What happened was, I ended up calling in a lot of sick days to go travel to Austin, to Houston, to San Antonio to pick up deals off of Craigslist. And back then I had a mentor that was kind of helping me out and showing me how to buy and sell watches. So I had a lot of confidence in myself. So I just said, screw it, you know what, I'm getting in trouble anyways at work because I'm taking time off to go do a business that's actually making me more money, in a way shorter span of time than it is to just sit there and park cars all day for the airport. So I decided, let's do it. I'm going to quit, and I'm going to focus on this full time. So from 2014, I was a full-time watch dealer. It was a struggle in the beginning. I had a lot of setbacks, but I definitely powered through it. To put it in perspective, the first sport model I ever bought was a ceramic Rolex Submariner, and I paid $5,000 complete for it. So, that was the going rate for ceramic subs back in 2014, 15. You could buy a black for $5 to $55, and a green was like $6 to $6,500. And GMTs were $45 to $5,000. I would say the early on challenges of becoming a watch dealer full time was not having all the connections that I needed back then to really start my network. So my biggest thing was, every time I'd have a watch, I was pretty much relying on the first 2 or first 3 wholesalers that I met. So I would just basically flip everything to them, and I'm sure they were retailing the stuff out far more than I was selling it to them for. And I learned a lot of lessons that way, because I, like anybody else, would buy and sell something and realize I sold it far too cheap because I didn't have the knowledge of knowing what it was. And an example of that, if you understand the vintage market, I bought a gilt dial GMT, so it was a 66, and obviously nobody told me it was a gilt dial. So when I sold it for $6,500 and realized later on that was a $13,000 watch, it stung. And it definitely drove me to read more and study more about my products, and I definitely, buckled down on knowledge. Facebook groups started you started noticing Facebook groups back in 16, 17. They started popping up. So I have to give a huge credit to the Moda groups. The Moda groups is definitely where I saw a huge increase from my local sales all of a sudden became national, and all of a sudden my wholesale outlets all of a sudden became national. So all of a sudden I was connecting with people in Miami, people in LA, people in New York. All of a sudden they were buying and bugging me every day, and then I was just, everything I touched I was selling so fast. So it was probably the best thing to happen to me early on was joining those Facebook groups. And nowadays, they're still significant, especially to guys who are just starting. The first and biggest setback I had as a watch dealer was probably one that hit home the worst, and I was robbed, and I wasn't just robbed by anybody. I was robbed by my best friend. This is somebody I grew up with. You know, when I was 13 years old, I would consider my best friend since we were 13, and he started developing mental problems around when I was 26 and already pretty engaged. Like my first year out as a full-time watch dealer, I just now started having a little inventory, having a little bit of money to play with. And I left him at my house one day to take my, at the time, girlfriend to lunch. And, I come home and my safe's gone and my computer's gone and all these other things are gone. And I was just like, and he was gone. So immediately I thought, he jumped off the deep end and took my stuff, or he's pranking me. I couldn't tell which one because I was so confused. Well, I tried to call him, get a hold of him, couldn't get him all day, so I just realized, okay, yeah, he robbed me. He stole all my stuff, and I was freaking out. I mean, I had everything I ever worked for in the safe, and it was gone. And from that point, so when he took everything, I was left with nothing. I had to start over from the ground all the way up. So I did not end up getting another job. That was the one thing I told myself I wouldn't do. I wouldn't succumb to it. I wouldn't, let this destroy everything I worked for. I mean, there was some stroke of luck to everything. One, I was doing my laundry a week later. I found $500. And that was a little bit of a hoorah to that moment. And then there was the second thing was I had a Rolex Submariner and a Datejust being polished by a watchmaker. So, luckily that didn't, that didn't get taken. So that was kind of like a start over to my foundation. So I went from having 30 grand in watches with cash back down to like 5, but I made sure it actually lit a fire in me and to just work harder and harder and harder. I think it actually inspired me to just really, really, really work for what I wanted, and don't let this situation own you. So that was a big attribution to all, where I am today. So actually, I met my business partner Anthony in the motor groups and a group chat, a private group chat called Mazal and Chill, where him and I engaged on a Breitling, and he committed to it and asked me, hey, he asked me to ship it, and I was like, sure, send me your address, and he sent me the address to a building in Uptown down the street from me. I was like, yo, I can just bring you this watch. And he was like, what? Oh, I didn't even know he was in the same city as me. So it was kind of an interesting discovery. And then when we met each other, we started talking about, what he did and what I did, and how everything kind of worked out. Was basically, he was very strong on the social media. I was very strong on the wholesale. I had a lot of watch knowledge. He didn't know as much back then as I did on just basic watches. So he definitely leaned on me, and I leaned on him for the social media, and he leaned on me for the watch knowledge and the wholesale stuff. So, I think we did a few deals, and I think we just came together and said, you know what, like, actually, I'll tell you what we did. He invited me to a Halloween party where I ended up going over there and discovering that he was a really good online hustler as far as his presentation online goes versus what he really had. So it kind of, it kind of had me going thinking like, oh man, because he had really, really good inventory online. And what I discovered was he was floating the inventory from all the watch dealers that I knew onto his website, and it was genius because I never thought of doing something like that. So when it came around to it, I was like, why don't you just take all my watches and sell them, put them on your website, and I'll just let you exclusively sell them. And he agreed to do it. And then I think that's that's just how our partnership formed. So early on, Anthony and I, we started by running a website, thetimepiecegentleman.com, and we put a lot of the inventory we had, it was all my inventory at the time, on there, and I pulled them into a project. I was like, hey, I'm working on something really big, and back then I was working with a jewelry store to be their primary watch guy, and they needed, they knew diamonds and they knew jewelry, but they didn't know watches, so they were pulling me in, so I wanted to pull Anthony in with it, and it was a big project, and so they built out this huge jewelry store, had probably a couple $1 million in inventory, and I pulled Anthony into it. So I gave Anthony a lot of content back then to use to sell watches, and we obviously had a large inventory all of a sudden. So that was a really cool contribution to what I brought to the table back then. Anthony and I early on got pulled into a jewelry store to work with their watch department. They didn't really have any watch guys there, so they were kind of like relying on our expertise. And at the time, Anthony's social media presence was brought onto the table to help promote them and so forth. And we really put in the time and effort to make it happen. And I think later on we realized that, we had enough inventory at the time to just kind of do it more so on our own, because like we had creative differences with this jewelry store, and I think we just realized, if we just break off of this, and it'll be a setback, but we definitely killed it later on. We just kept building up on our social media presence. So the early days of watch dealing for me was pretty interesting. It mostly involved me backpacking around the city. I spent lots of time jumping from pawn shop to pawn shop, looking for inventory, and I wouldn't just stick to my town. I would drive to Austin, I would drive to San Antonio, I would drive to Houston, and I would just go around to different pawn shops looking for watches, which actually worked out very, very well. In the early days, there was plenty of stuff to find. Almost every pawn shop had at least a Datejust I could buy. So it was worth it. So I spent most weekends out of town. It was lots of miles on my car, and just lots of meeting people at coffee shops and meeting people all over the place, which was obviously risky business back then, because you got to think, you're a guy with a backpack with lots of cash, lots of watches, meeting people in public places, not always the safest bet, which has proven to be the case in a few instances. I've been robbed. Nothing major, but they were setbacks back then. But that was the day in the life of a early on watch dealer. My biggest connection to the vintage world was everybody in Dallas did not care about vintage watches. They wanted the newest and greatest thing, and I took on a liking to vintage watches. So I think I've made that my niche, and I just became very knowledgeable in that field, and I'd get calls like every day about vintage watches that would come in people's store, and they didn't know anything about them. So of course I was able to buy them, and the margins on vintage watches back then were definitely what accelerated me to grow my business. A guy called me this should have been their first red flag. Guy calls me at 11 at night. I'm about to go to bed, and he says, "Hey, I see you have a Rolex President for sale. It's, it was listed at $11,000, and it was a double quick set, 18238. And, the guy said he was buying it for his father, and it was a gift, and that he was staying at the hotel down the street from me." And I was like, sure, sounds legit. He said he's going to pay in cash, and he'll meet me in the lobby somewhere safe. And I was like, it sounds good. The next day, I go up to the hotel, and I valet parked my car, went inside, met him up, and he seemed okay. I didn't really have any, he didn't give off any red flags at the time, but again, I didn't know what I was looking for. And he's, as soon as we were about to close on the deal, he stood up with the watch in his hand and just bolted out the door. And then so I chased him down like a madman and just ran after him until we got to the parking lot. Then he hopped in his truck, and of course I was like roaring with rage, so I just stood in front of his truck like trying to get him to give me my watch back, and he just didn't care. He actually inched his truck out of the parking lot, and then as soon as he started driving off, I tried to jump in the back of his truck. I was like, what, screw this, we're gonna go together. Like, I was just absolutely mad, and I don't know what I was thinking at the time, but I actually did not get in the back of his truck, and he knocked me off the truck by, I guess, accelerating, and then I think I broke a rib or two, because I was not okay for 6 weeks. I've got the ER bills to prove it. Okay, so to bring you guys back to 2018 when I met Anthony, we had just tried to make it work with the jewelry store business. and that was, that was okay, but it just didn't pan out. So we ended up splitting off, working at as an apartment, and then around that time, after that, closer to 2019, we actually ended up hiring our first assistant, and we worked with him for quite some time, and then it was time to grow. The next phase was getting a co-op space because we couldn't get a traditional office at the time. So, we ended up with a WeWork, and that was fine and that was great. We actually planned out our first, WeWork space. We did the whole thing and got our first safe. So, it was official then when we had a 4,000-pound safe. So we were pretty excited about that move. And then closer to 2020, COVID hits. The whole watch market goes to a screeching halt for 6 weeks straight. And Anthony and I are we're a little freaked out. I mean, we've never been through anything like this, and there's no business, there's nothing going on, and we just don't know what to do. We decide not to make any irrational decisions and just decide to keep our heads low for the time being. We took a mini vacation. We just kind of ended up staying home for the most part because, everybody was freaked out from going outside and the whole mask thing started going on. And after all that kind of settled in, the watch market just explodes. And next thing you know, him and I are just hustling every day. I mean, all of a sudden prices are shooting through the roof. And that kind of just ties in today's market. I mean, this market is still going crazy. I mean, this market is very explosive and it doesn't seem to be calming down. The AP market just keeps going up. I mean, you're looking at 60 grand for 15,500 blues. I mean, this is back a year ago when those first came out. I think we were paying at the most 37,000 for those. So those are on the way to doubling. And it's just been an amazing ride since. I mean, it's only been 3 years of being with Gentleman Timepieces, and it's been astonishing. And it seems like the sky's the limit. We're building out our first big major retail outlet, and we've got a lot of things in the books coming up that are going to be really exciting, and the story just keeps going. Working out of the Crescent's been pretty fun and pretty exciting, but it's coming to the point where it's kind of a headache because our business is booming so much and continuously booming so much that we almost have no space left to work out of there. It's time to grow. The next step in the business, guys, and I think it's going to be the most exciting, is we're going to up the ante. So we're going to build out our first superstore. It's going to be a massive 5,000 to 6,000 square foot shop. It's a one-stop shop. You can come and buy your watches. You get the VIP experience. We've got the lounges for you guys to come hang out in. We've got the coffee shop built into the store, so there's no need to go get a cup of coffee or anything like that. We'll take care of everything. So this is going to be a very exciting project for Anthony and I to be working on in the next few months, so we'll definitely be busy. I mean, you guys will be seeing some progress on the channel. And we also have some other things up and coming that are going to be exciting towards the end of the year that I think you guys are really going to like. I'm not going to say much, but you're going to see some awesome, awesome things coming. And I just want to close this out, guys, by thanking you guys so much for taking the time to view my story. And I really wanted you guys to understand a little bit more about myself and to really get a perspective of who I am and how Anthony and I work so well together.
So, one thing I'll say that I've learned that's really effective when I start these talks is I want to tell you where I'm at today and then backtrack it, because I feel like that gets people's attention. And if you rewind 4 years ago, I was still in a prison cell. I was a month away from getting out and going to a halfway house. 3.5 years ago, I was just getting out of a halfway house. This year, my company's looking at doing roughly 40 to 45 million in sales.
Nice.
Next year, we will be.
Man, that's awesome.
Great for you.
And both of you are looking at me, and yes, I helped just today, so we'll talk about that later.
Yes, you did. You put us on. You're helping us stay on track. 40 to 45 million in sales this year. Next year, we will be, if everything, God forbid, nothing major happens, we will be $100 million a year company.
Wow, that's awesome.
In 4.5 years. So that's where I am today. Going back to what got me to this, I've got an interesting story like many people. But it's different. I actually grew up in a good home. We were well taken care of. We weren't poor, but we weren't rich. We went to private school up through 8th grade. My parents I was adopted. I have a twin brother. My parents couldn't have kids, so they adopted both my twin brother and I together. They also adopted us a sister. Wanted the best for us, put us in private school. My brother and I talked my parents into transitioning us from from private school to public school and high school so we could play sports. The problem with going to private school is you're very sheltered and you're very protected. I didn't understand what real life was like. So my first sign, I was an A+ student in private school. I excelled. Went to public school, and that's when I started, screwing up. I don't know if we can cuss on here. But
Yeah, go ahead. All day.
Please do.
That's when I started fucking up.
It's encouraged.
I feel much more comfortable.
My vision of how public school went was what I saw on TV because that's all I knew. So I thought it was cool to cut up in class. I thought it was cool to talk back to teachers, not do homework. Freshman year I was not expelled but suspended. Sophomore year I came back and I showed what I could really do, and I was a saint with flying colors. Right. So starting on my junior year I was popular, but I quickly fucked that up by getting suspended again. And then senior year I decided I didn't want to deal with it, so we had our parents move us to another high school. So I spent my senior year at one high school where I didn't realize that word traveled from high school to high school. So I thought I was going to be able to run from my problems at one high school, and no, they followed me right there. So then I hated all my senior year. I was ready to get out of high school. I finally got out. And then, again, still sheltered. Never went to a house party, never had a sleepover throughout high school, never drank, never saw a drug. I get out, I move out of my parents' house right after I turned 18, moved into this house. I lived with a stripper and her boyfriend and another guy, and it was on.
Yeah.
I was going to say,
look,
that's a definite game changer right there. Right.
She was cool. I won't say her name in case she's listening, but they were bad. That was my first introduction to. I remember my first drink. They were like, "We're gonna have a party. What do you drink?" And I was like, the usual stuff, trying to sound cool.
Oh man!
And I think I had like one and a half Grey Goose and Sprites, and I passed out on the floor. And I woke up the next morning. And thought, "Holy shit! Drinking is nothing that they taught me about in private school." Because in private school, they were, they taught you that the drugs are bad, the world is bad, alcohol's bad. If you touch these things, you're just gonna die right then. And it was the opposite. I had so much fun. So much fun. So I didn't believe anything that my parents told me. I didn't believe anything that authority told me growing up. I was just like, y'all had it wrong.
Right.
So
this is awesome.
I get out, I start working, I start adult. College was never for me. Right. My parents, thank God, they never, I say thank God, most people would be like, what are you talking about? But my parents never asked me about college. They never pushed me into filling out applications for college. It was just kind of like, I think one time they were like, hey, are you going to go to college? And I said, nah. Yeah. And they're just like, okay. But I also had this realization early on. I was like, it doesn't really sound appealing to get out and go to college and spend 4 years busting my ass to get out, get a mediocre job that I'm going to have to spend 10 more years at kissing someone's ass to maybe by that point, my mid to late 30s, I'll be making $100,000 a year because that's the goal.
So was at that point you kind of had, or have you always had the entrepreneurial mindset, or was that kind of the turning point that like you're getting older and you're realizing what the reality is and you're like, that kind of sucks?
It wasn't the entrepreneurial. I just knew I wanted to be rich,
right?
Or I wanted to make money,
right?
So I hadn't really had that desire to go out on my own yet, but I definitely knew I was going to be able to work harder and make more money, just getting straight into the workforce than going to college.
Okay.
So that's what I did. I moved to Dallas and I became a personal trainer. I was bartending 4 or 5 nights a week on the popular at the popular bars. And then, like I said, this was my first introduction to like real adulthood life. No boundaries, no disciplines, no.
So you're living with a stripper and you're bartending at all these popular restaurants.
Yes.
Well,
getting drunk every night.
There you go.
But in one sense, I felt like I was still responsible because I was a trainer 5 days a week at a gym, 8 hours a day,
Right.
and then I would go bartend 3 or 4 nights a week. So I was making really good money.
Okay.
Problem was I was never taught how to manage money, so I was spending more than I was making.
Gotcha.
So for this cycle, I'll like jump around a little bit, but for this cycle of 10 years, I was living above my means, paycheck to paycheck, but I was making really good money.
Okay.
Partying every night of the week, and it seemed like every career I went into, I went from personal training to bartending to real estate. I did a few little side things in between there, and it just seemed like I'd found this niche where the more I partied and the more I became known socially, the better I did. And it happened. I wanted to become a real estate agent, but I didn't know how to do it.
Right.
I went out to a club one night and I met this guy that happened to own his own brokerage firm. And he said, come work for me and my team. And that my first day there, I told him about some friends of mine that had a property for sale, and it happened to be a $2.5 million property. They got the listing, and I got a check 2 months later for $40,000
Nice.
for a simple
Nice.
introduction. I was like, holy
Wow.
shit,
Right.
just from partying.
Yeah, like that's all you got. What's next? Like,
I know. Well, there's more. I mean, there's more than that. But
How many lap dances did you get with that girl? Was it like
know,
1,000 lap dances?
she was a stripper, and I add that in there because it just makes it's like clickbait. It like makes the story
Yeah,
really
right.
really
Right.
fucking cool. But outside of knowing that she was like outside of her actually telling me I stripped for a living, you wouldn't believe it.
Right.
Wholesome
Really?
girl,
That's good.
beautiful, down to earth. Boyfriend was cool as shit.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
she was
why wouldn't you be?
she was the one cool stripper that actually was, stripping to pay for college or something.
Right.
But
Diamond in the
Hard
rough.
gold, right? Yeah,
also
right.
strong work ethic.
strong work ethic.